Hi everyone, welcome. So in this presentation, we're going to be talking about civil rights, right? So there'll be two videos on civil rights this week. This first one kind of going over some of the historical roots of the changes, so slavery, Reconstruction, and Jim Crow. And first, apologize for everything in the background. There's now a face cam. You can see me. We'll try it out this week so you get, if you guys like it, rather than my face not being on camera. So when we talk about these legacies, right, of slavery and then later on, right, after the Civil War, right, why are we going to focus on civil rights in these couple of videos, right, is when we talk about civil liberties, right, the freedoms we have, they're of course extremely important, right, but civil rights govern how we interact with the political system, how we're able to vote, receive public goods, right. Often there's a focus on voting here, right, but in many, many other domains, so schooling, right, policing, many other areas where our interactions with the government, right, are constrained by laws, whether state or federal, right? Understanding civil rights and their application is extraordinarily important. And of course, one of the reasons we talk about them is they've been historically unequal, right? And they've expanded, of course, to more groups, right? Over the years, but they're still unequally applied in many ways, whether kind of just by fact or by law. And of course, many of the debates, right, that have been had politically over the U.S. history have been kind of not explicitly about civil rights. They've been implicitly about civil rights. Many of the debates about kind of expansion in the United States and the Senate in the early 19th century is part of that. And of course, right, we still, and in the next video, we'll talk extensively about their unequal application today for many groups, right? And in particular, right, how when we talk about our interactions with the government, we may not all be equal in the eyes of the law, right? Despite, right, the Equal Protection Clause and these other kind of measures to change it. So when we talk about changes with respect to civil rights in American history, kind of an important way of thinking about this is if you go back to the very first week and some of the content I posted, right? If we think about politics as a game, right? We have players in the national level, we have politicians, we have states, we have the federal government, right? We also have us. And the debate and everything over civil rights, right, is about kind of who can play this game, right? Who is the government beholden to, right? Who can vote in it, right? Who receives the good that the government provides, right? And because of this, right, who is included in this and who is excluded in this and how laws are applied is extraordinarily important. And as a starting point, right, we're going to focus on a number of aspects. But I want to start with suffrage, with who can actually vote, because, right, this is kind of the core of participation in our political system. Obviously, there are other avenues, but this is critically important. And what's important to note first is that, like last week with federalism, right, many of the dynamics throughout this course, right, are complicated by federalism. And in fact, in the Constitution, right, states get to set their own suffrage rules. That is, who can vote. Right, in the Revolutionary period, most states had laws that varied exactly in how they worded it, but respectable men, so land-owning white men, right, were generally the ones able to vote, and not, right, destitute white men, not women, not persons of color, not Native Americans, right. None of these other groups were allowed to participate. By the 1840s or so, right, with the slow expansion in many states, right, some kind of big expansions with Andrew Jackson in the 1820s and 30s, we'll talk about a little bit with respect to partisanship next week, all white men were able to vote. But the federal government has intervened through history, in many cases through amendments to the Constitution, but as well as other actions kind of built on these amendments. Right. And so there are a number of interventions, right? We'll talk about the legacy of the Civil War and Reconstruction and the Reconstruction Amendments, right? The 15th Amendment expands it to non-whites, right, are able to vote, and you can't discriminate on previous condition of servitude, right, against former slaves, right? We see the 19th Amendment expand it to women in 1920, right? We see built on the 14th Amendment and other kind of justifications, the Indian Citizenship Act gives it to Native Americans, or the right to vote in 1924. Right. Later suspensions we'll talk about in the next video in the civil rights movement and the civil rights era, right? The suspension of poll taxes, the Department of Justice gets rid of literary tests and many things that were used by states to unequally apply the law. And then, of course, right, 18-year-olds get the right to vote with the 26th Amendment, kind of in response to many 18, 19, and 20-year-olds, right, fighting and dying in the Vietnam conflict. And so today, It varies state by state still, but if you're 18 or older, if you're a non-felon in many states, and the line here can be a little bit blurry, right? So if you're a current felon or if you served your senates and kind of paid, right? Some states now allow you to vote. You have to be a citizen. And there are a few exceptions, right? So other kind of people that have been declared mentally incompetent by courts and other things. And the restrictions here, right? So it's a pretty wide open game today, but still there are many restrictions that are kind of having increasing impacts over time, right? And particularly how they're applied by state governments, right? So if you think back to the 1960s and 70s, the number of felons in the United States is actually quite small by percentage of population. Right? Today, over 6 million individuals, right, have a felony, many of which are on drug charges and other things stemming from changes in policing in the criminal justice system in the 1990s. But it's increasingly consequential in discussing, right, who is basically able to participate in politics and receive the benefits of government. One of the things about this particular video, and particularly you can think of it as an irony, right, is that the safeguards that the framers are worried about when we talk about the Constitution and the federalism of dividing power between the state and federal government to prevent tyranny, right, many of these have actually slowed the expansion of civil rights to these other groups, African Americans to Native Americans to women, right, to Hispanic and Latino individuals, to Chinese migrants working on the railroads in the 1870s and 1880s, to many other groups that have come into the United States, right? The ability of state governments to slow roll these protections, right, and kind of granting rights has really limited this. And much of what we're going to talk about in this video and the next, right, is the kind of enduring story of advancement of civil rights in American history is centered on race. Partly because it is central, right? It's written into the Constitution, and slavery is in a couple different places, right? It's also one of the few places where we see the expansion of civil rights and with the Reconstruction amendments, and then the contraction again with Jim Crow. And we're going to talk about the political implications of this. And to be clear, right, many of these other groups will talk about kind of in their relevance and relatedness to this as well, right? In the chapter 5 in the textbook does a great job going through the advancement of many of these other groups and their ability to get civil rights and get the government to be beholden to them. And as a starting point, I want to talk about the Constitution, right? So Constitution is kind of our core rule book, right? It's always an important place to start. Is that in fact in 3 different places, slavery is explicitly written into the Constitution. Right. The first makes a note that one of the powers prohibited of Congress is they can't ban the slave trade until 1808, right, 20 years after the ratification of the Constitution. This is written in as a compromise because many southern states are worried that the Congress might kind of turn in the first or several sessions of Congress and limit the ability of them to import more slaves from Africa. There's also a fugitive slave clause in Article 4, in which the discussion of new states that are admitted is had, right, noting that states, basically slaves had to be treated as property. And then finally, right, an important place that we talked about in the first week as well, when we talk about the Constitution, is that for the purposes of apportionment, that is giving house seats to the particular states in the Constitution, other persons, essentially slaves, right, Native Americans, other people, that are not citizens, right, should be added as 3/5 of their total number. So it gives the South some of an outsized voice based on the slave population, but not count as full persons, because that, in the eyes of the North, would give them too much kind of representation. So this is where we start, right, with the civil rights of African Americans and then slaves, right, written into the Constitution. So how does this progress, right? How does it change over time? So the first thing to note is that first constitutional clause. Is that in 1807, right, the year before they're able to actually prohibit the import of slaves, they go ahead and pass legislation to ban this, effective, right, when it comes into force in the following year. And the South and many Southern kind of representatives and senators quickly realize that slavery is central to their economy, right, and they need to protect this. They need to prevent the ability of the North and the Congress itself to constrain their ability to continue chattel slavery. So, for much of the kind of first half of the 19th century, right, many of the efforts of the South, as the United States expands, are focused on maintaining this balance between slave states and free states. Right, because the Senate has equal representation, right, the South has, in many cases, right, a kind of an outsized role because of the unequal population, right, across the various states. And while the representation in the House is a little bit outsized because of the Three-Fifths Clause, the Senate is really where the battles are had. And so if we walk through the advancement, right, and an expansion in the United States through the middle of the 19th century, while much of it's about westward expansion, a huge amount of it is about bargaining over the issue of slavery. So if we look at this map of the original kind of setup in 1789, right, of the 13 colonies that are admitted as states, right, the slave states have kind of a majority, 8 to 5, right, including New York and northern states that quickly and later banned slavery. If we fast forward to 1800, right, you can slowly see the expansion a bit, right? We now have a 9-to-8 balance, right? And this is even before the before the Congress passes kind of the ban on the import of slaves. Fast forward a bit longer, we eventually end up kind of tied in 1821. There are a number of important kind of pieces of history here, right? The Missouri Compromise, noting that Missouri be allowed as a slave state north of this parallel, but the only one really. And we can keep advancing, right? If we go kind of forward to 1837, also important, right? Because we begin to see the disputes of the Mexican-American War and the reason why, right? California ends up in the United States and not Mexico. We keep see advancement, right? And every time these new states are being brought in, right, there are a number of bargains being struck about who is, right, able to be brought in, what states are able to be brought in as a slave state or a free state, right? California is brought in 1850 as part of the Compromise of 1850 as a free state. And finally, we see, right, the balance of power in the Senate tip in favor of the free states. And this sets the groundwork, right, for the coming Civil War here, because suddenly, right, the South are on their heels. They no longer have kind of this veto power in the Senate to keep the practice of slavery alive. And of course, by the time the Civil War kind of already breaks, right, the balance is even further. So when we think about this expansion across all these maps, right, is the slave state advantage finally collapses when California comes into the Union, right, in the several years after the Mexican-American War finishes. The South gets a fugitive slave law that's stronger and several other compromises to appease them. The 1850s, are filled with a number of important cases and other decisions, right, and a lot of kind of conflict that serves as a precursor for the war, right? So the Supreme Court rules in 1857, very importantly, right? Essentially, the federal government can't prevent slavery in territories, right? A very wrong-headed decision at the time and today, right? And in fact, right, notes in kind of this in this particular decision, right, that essentially African Americans are still not recognized, right, as equal by any mean legally to white men. When Abraham Lincoln is elected in 1860, right, the writing's already on the wall, right, South Carolina secedes, and he announces, right, there's going to be no tolerance for Southern slavery. And so we begin to see, right, the Civil War. And in fact, right, I don't want to gloss over the Civil War and the particular politics of this era, but I want to draw out a few important threads about how civil rights advance and slowly begin to backslide for African Americans in response to this. So notably, many people point to the Emancipation Proclamation in 1862, right, noting specifically that slaves in rebellious states would be freed, but actually not universally, right? This is not the end of slavery. We don't see that till the 13th Amendment. And in particular, right, this is intended to encourage defection from many slaves in the South to fight on the side of the North against the South. By the end of the Civil War conflict, right, over 500,000 Americans are dead, right, and we begin to see some political changes, right. You have to reintegrate, if you're the North, you have to reintegrate the South into your political structure, which is not an easy task. And as such, a few amendments come in, which are basically kind of a non-negotiable, right, for Southern states to ratify in order for them to be readmitted. The first and kind of a very important one, obviously, is the 13th Amendment that abolishes slavery in the United States. We see the 14th Amendment come in a few years later. It contains a number of clauses, right, defining citizenship, discussing due process, providing for equal protection of the law is kind of a key concept throughout our discussion of civil rights for all groups. And then finally, right, in the 15th Amendment, 1870, giving the right for people of all races to vote. And what's interesting about the 15th Amendment, right, is this last bit here about the previous condition of servitude, right? Already the North knows that whatever restrictions, the South will try to build in whatever restrictions they can on African Americans and on former slaves. And so they want to kind of get rid of that loophole. So there are a number of changes coming, right? Is this era of Reconstruction, right? There's a huge amount going on that's incredibly consequential for much of American history going on in this era. And there are a few kind of defining characteristics that are important to highlight. The first is that the Republican Party, right, has to bring in these southern states back into the Union. There are a number of punitive measures that the Northern Republicans, right, Lincoln has been assassinated, but many carry on the kind of the politics of the day, right? And there are punitive measures, so banning people who had served from the South, right, or had served on the Confederate side from holding office in states. There's a large push for African American participation. This is when you actually see the first few African American members of Congress and a number of African Americans in state politics in the South, because they're largely put in place, right, by the Republican majority here. But by the 1870s or so, right, Republicans begin to lose. We begin to see, right, restrictions and others kind of creep back in. And by the end of kind of the formal period of Reconstruction in 1877, right, federal troops have left the South, right, leaving many of these people who kind of survived and lived through the Civil War conflict more able to put back in place restrictions they wish. And so we begin to see a number of restrictions that creep back in. And they're important to discuss because the legacy of kind of the expansion of civil rights with respect to African Americans, crucially, is not a kind of a unidirectional, right, thing. We see, right, a number of attempts to kind of continue the power structure that exists before the Civil War. And through this era, right, the time bounds are a little bit blurry here. People will, kind of define it a little bit differently because many of these Jim Crow laws, right, last through the 1960s. But when we talk about Jim Crow laws, we mean kind of two types of laws here. The first are laws that are intended to disenfranchise, right, so prevent African Americans from voting, right, but also segregate them, right, keep them separate in public spaces and in public resources, and keep them separate from whites. There are a number of rules regarding segregation, right? Basically, every government entity or office, and many private ones, obviously, right? All of these are affected by it, and of course, right, massive discrimination in public business or in private business as well. But there are a number of important kind of enfranchisement and voting restrictions that occur in this era too. Right, so the South is largely kind of led by the Democratic Party in this era. Stay tuned for next week when we talk about how the parties change, right? I'll be posting a ton of content about this. But in fact, because parties, right, are private organizations, they could have a Democratic Party in the South, an entirely white primary. That is, you had to be white in order to vote in the primary. And if the Democratic primary is where basically all the decisions are made anyway, because a Republican can't win in the general, right, then you effectively exclude African Americans from participating. You can ask individuals if they wanted to vote to pay a poll tax, right? Kind of discriminating against those who are less wealthy, right? And restricting it to only those who could afford to pay. Establishing literacy tests, right? Not just kind of testing whether someone's literate or not, but interpreted and scored by local officials that could score it, right? In a way in which African Americans were disenfranchised systematically. And of course, grandfather clauses kind of paired with poll taxes. So if you had a grandfather who was able to vote before the Civil War, basically exclusively meaning white individuals, right, you might be exempt from a poll tax. So allowing those to be unequally applied. A number of other changes are worth highlighting, right, through this era. So Plessy v. Ferguson is kind of a canonical case to talk about. And in fact, right, this goes before the Supreme Court, and it's relatively simple on the facts. So Homer Plessy, who is not white, sits in a whites-only railroad car in Louisiana. And the Supreme Court effectively declares systematic segregation constitutional, right? That is, the 14th Amendment's application only applies to what we discuss as political equality, so voting and these other institutions and interactions with the government. Right, and that this segregation was allowed, right, on the railroad and in basically all domains throughout the South, right, and kind of the phrase that comes out of the case, right, is separate but equal. That is, the institutions had to be equal, but they could be separate, and you could enforce segregation. Which, of course, right, if you have separation, it's impossible to make them fully equal. Other kind of drawn out bits of this, right, that are important to note is that kind of when discussing discrimination and separation here, right, that the focus is on showing kind of intent, not just effects. That is, you can't effectively kind of win court cases and you're just showing differential outcomes for individuals. You have to show that it is intended to be discriminatory based on race. So things begin to change, right? I'm going to jump forward in history a bit here to kind of highlight how and why things begin to change as a segue into our next video, right? So throughout this era, many African Americans who could, very few in the South could because of these Jim Crow laws, were generally voted Republican until the 1930s, right? Until the market crash of 1929, where the Democratic Party is still very much the party of Southern whites. And the Republican Party, right, aligned with business and other things kind of in the beginning of the 20th century, right, are still kind of the core, continue to have African Americans as a core constituency. And then, of course, right, the Great Depression begins in 1929. We'll talk about some of these changes with respect to parties next week. And the New Deal is highly popular, right, expanding the government's role in a huge array of domains in healthcare. Or healthcare comes a little later, right? Social Security, the putting people to work and these other things, right? And many of these programs, right, are applied across a wide variety of people, white and black. And so we begin to see the Democratic coalition build here. And this kind of has some important implications for how the parties shift on civil rights, which we'll talk about in the next video and next week. Right, is there's a huge diverse coalition, right, within the Democratic Party. And in fact, right, we see integration in society rise by quite a bit as African Americans join kind of the labor force and in many of the industrial factories and other places where they had previously not been welcome. But also, of course, even though they're segregated for some of it, right, they're able to fight alongside white troops in World War II. There are a number of other changes, right, in this era. The Congress of Industrial Organizations, right, which is a union, right, and some of the Democratic Party began aligning around civil rights causes, right, and pushing for kind of more liberal policies on civil rights and more political equality, getting rid of some of the Jim Crow laws in the South. And as a consequence, we see the Democrats start to lose in the South. That is particularly in 1948, Strom Thurmond runs as a states' rights Democrat, effectively defending, right, the Jim Crow institutions and discriminatory institutions, and peels this off, right, from the Democratic Party, which has not an incredibly consequential, right, effect on this election, right, but does so in the coming decades. So with that, that's it for this video. Look forward to talking with you more about the civil rights movement and era and the lessons we can draw from that, not just for African Americans, but for other groups in the next video. Thanks for listening.